Hi, I'm Laurie Battaglia, the CEO of Aligned at Work. Welcome to the Wake Up Call Live, where we have authentic, action-oriented conversations about creating truly inclusive lives and workplaces where people feel they belong. In this time of significant change and debate around workplace inclusion, we're bringing you the perspectives and the practical solutions that matter. It's about real people and real impact. Each month, I sit down with change makers who are navigating these complex waters of life and work. We dive deep into what's working, what isn't, and what's next in leadership and life. I invite you to be part of this important conversation. Drop your questions and insights into the comments, and we'll address them live during the show and continue the discussion afterward. Your voice matters in shaping the future of work. I can't wait for you to meet today's guest. And here we are. So welcome, everybody. I am excited about today's Wake Up Call Live because someone that I've known for a number of years now is here to talk about a topic that we don't talk about a lot, especially in regard to leadership. So join me in welcoming Uday Bulasani. He and I met probably 2018, I think it was, at a conference called InvestOps. We hit it off. Both of us have long histories in the finance world, and we hit it off and we talked various times across the years between then and now. And when I thought about this month and honoring autism and speaking about it, I immediately thought of you, Uday, because you now have positioned yourself as the autistic leader. So give us a little bit about your background and what you hope to cover today with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your show, and this is a great opportunity. Like you said, I happen to take on a formal position, I guess, publicly to disclose that I am autistic, to advocate, to help folks understand what it means in the workplace, right? To understand what it means, from a personal perspective to an extent as well, right? I believe in vulnerability and being vulnerable in leadership. So this is me doing that a little bit. So it is worth noting that everything I say here, these are my personal thoughts, personal comments. They don't represent any employer at all.
Right. Okay. Matter of fact, I don't even know that we're going to speak about specific employers today. We're going to talk about you and how you came to this. And then we're going to talk about how it affects people as leader, like autistic people who are leaders, and then how leaders need to change their points of view and some of the actions that they do. So how did you figure out that you are autistic? How did that come about for you? And how did you kind of go through the motions of figuring this out?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's actually something that you would think is like relatively straightforward, right? Like there's a diagnostic process. You go to get checked out like you would anything else with the doctor.
Yeah.
It's actually not that simple. It's not that straightforward. And a lot of people don't know that. So let me provide a little bit of context. So maybe if it's okay, I'll start with what is the criterion. And so I have a resource in front of me. So I'll read through the medical criterion.
Perfect.
So number one, under the psychological umbrella, there is a diagnostic manual that all psychologists use, generally globally, but it's not necessarily the guiding, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual for this, the DSM-5, is not necessarily 100% globally, but it's used across the globe. So from an autism perspective, very specifically, one thing to note is in 2013, it shifted to what's now called autism spectrum disorder, which combined a bunch of different diagnoses into one, right? So as an example, pre-2013, I would have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
Okay.
Right? Then there's classic autism. There's Connors syndrome, pervasive development disorder as an example. So there's a couple of different ones that are wrapped into the concept. So under autism spectrum disorder, which is what the DSM-5 has it, my specific diagnosis is level 1 autism spectrum disorder. There's level 1, 2, and 3 without intellectual disability.
Okay.
Right? So that's an important one because people also assume that autism is an intellectual disability, meaning, right?
Yes.
And even this term has definition differences in like a legal and educational perspective from how we think about intellect as in like intellectual impairment, IQ. right? It
Mhm.
doesn't, it can have that co-functioning item that comes with it, but it itself is not necessarily intellectual disability by itself. So what are the criterion, right? Just so that folks know from a pure medical lens, what are people using to diagnose someone, right? And so what criteria do you have to meet? One of the most important things is that it has to be lifelong, right? It is
Okay.
something that has existed throughout your life, right? And one thing that occurs, especially when you're late diagnosed, is that it could be that you've learned so many different things in how to portray yourself, how to use your cognitive resources to appear in a very normative way. And
Mhm.
then you may not necessarily show the symptoms outright. And so when, stress induces more obvious symptoms, quote unquote, is when it might be more visible. So
Okay.
criteria A, right? And one thing that I'll do is the medical criterion uses the word deficit. So
Okay.
everywhere you hear me use the word difference, I'm replacing the word deficit, but everything else is medical,
Okay.
right? So
Sounds good. But
persistent
not medical
difference,
advice. Yes.
yes,
Not
yes.
medical
So
advice. Right.
criterion A has three things. So you have persistent differences in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by, it could be a couple of different things. It could be things like tone. It could be things like initiating conversation, having a monotone voice, or the opposite because you're overcompensating, small talk, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's also within that same subcategory another example of nonverbal communicative behavior might be difficulty intuitively understanding nonverbal social cues,
Okay.
tendency to minimally communicate through facial expressions or body gestures, right? So a lot of what I do with my hands has become like for my own speaking competitions and stuff that I did as a kid.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's like a little bit of that compensation. Another example is, outright that says in the criterion, like an example, difficulty moderating tone and or volume of voice.
Okay.
Then criterion B talks about restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, activities, and it could be any of these two following versions of how that manifests. Either you have a stereotyped of repetitive motor movements, so use of objects or speech, but also insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, right? These are what can manifest. And then the most important thing is that it's none of these are alone. They all have to exist together to be actually diagnosed. So there's also C, D, and E. So the traits have to be present in early developmental period, but they may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or be masked by learning strategies in later life. Your traits cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational or other important areas of functioning. And these disturbances, quote unquote, are not better explained by intellectual disability or global development delay. So that's the important piece to understand is that when you hear some of these things, from a practical perspective, you might say, yeah, there's certain routines that I like to keep as a human. Those routines help me, right? Well, routines alone are normal human behavior.
Right.
Social
Right.
communication differences, social communication is normal human behavior. Each of these alone have degrees of differences. When all of them coexist at the same time, and the degree of difference is enough that it impacts your um, ability to really thrive in life, is when you get diagnosed.
Okay. Okay. So for you, every time you're identifying these things, I'm a Big Bang Theory fan, and I keep thinking Sheldon, because Sheldon had to be taught social cues. Sheldon had to be taught he'd say something and then he'd say sarcasm because he was, learning how to interact with other people, and his friends were pointing it out. So for you, you got all the way to adulthood without words for it. What was the thing that made you kind of go down this rabbit hole and think, what is this? How did it come into your life?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? So, what's interesting is that while it's a solid question, and you would assume that something specific must have triggered it, most often it's not a specific incident, right? With most late diagnosed, from my own conversations as well as my own life, what I've found is that it ends up being two types of scenarios. Scenario one is a caregiver who is working through the process with their kids.
Yeah.
And then as their kids are getting diagnosed and they learn all the criterion,
Yeah.
you're like, you're also talking about me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so that's a common late diagnosed component. This is because of all of the developments that have occurred over the past 30, 40 years in the space. And the second is where I sit. You go through life, you go through conversations, you go through, luckily, you may watch a podcast like this, or your company might do neurodiversity at work, and you're celebrating the week, and you hear stories and you hear people, and you're like, that's different.
Right.
That's how I am. What do you mean
Yeah.
that's different? And all of a sudden you're like, wait, and you go down a rabbit hole. And so so what happened with me, it was very simplistic, right? We were in period of COVID. My employer at the time had a standard EAP program, employee assistance program, right? So the beauty of those programs was that you didn't have to, historically, where if you wanted to go to therapy, you had to have something that was bothering you. You had to get approved through insurance. It was certified as like, a fix. Well, what these EAP programs did was give you access to say, well, you want to go talk to someone, no different than preventative care, go do it.
Yes.
We were going through a significant world change, right? Right. So we were promoting as leaders, please use this. And I'm always been of the person, if I'm going to promote something as a leader, if I don't do it myself, then I'm not being authentic. Right. Yes. So that was literally how I started the EAP program. Was like, we're offering this benefit. How am I going to reliably tell my teams, please go use this benefit if I myself don't know what it entails? So that's how I kicked it off. Nothing more, nothing less. Right. Let me talk about COVID. Let me talk about, what it means to shift and what's happening at work. How has work changed? Right. We had Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and I wanted to talk about the world, and I want to talk about with someone who is supposed to be a professional outside of my friends and personal relationships.
Yeah.
It was during that process, engaging with the master's licensed therapist, that certain concepts came up of how I experience life, things that occur in my life, things that occur personal world throughout my whole life, that the question came up. Have you ever thought that maybe some of these experiences, like the connection that I'm seeing, might be autism?
Yeah.
Like there's a couple of times in my life people have mentioned it, but I just always kind of brush it off as like that person's just being rude or making a joke.
Right.
Or not. Right. They're just judging me. Cool.
Yeah.
But it made me think. And so I got a referral, and then I went to a PhD therapist, right? Because that person was, and that therapist wasn't able to diagnose either, but because they had a PhD, we had a really, again, outside of this dimension, we had some great conversations, and she said, Uday, you know what? Like, I think we've explored this, and from what I can tell, this might be a real possibility. The world is evolving in what people think about this, what it means. I don't think it has the same stigmas. I'm going to give you a formal referral. If you want? And I said, yeah, let's do that. Right. And I happened to find a great specialist who was a neurodiversity specialist. She was an autistic and ADHD therapist herself. So she had lived experience, was doing significant research across like MIT and Yale. And so like she was very well credentialed, and she specialized in late diagnosed adults who didn't have intellectual disability, right? So the much harder version of it to spot, that was her specialty.
Okay.
So that was the process. And then I went through everything that comes with that. You do a full social history. There's different differential diagnoses tests, like, that you see, is there elements of OCD? Is there elements of ADHD, bipolar? Like, right. So it's a broad range of, let's understand what's going on. And through that process, I got my formal diagnosis, which was February 2024 now.
That's really amazing. I've watched a couple of other friends, like on Facebook and stuff, self-identify like, hey, I just figured this out. Hey, I got diagnosed. And they wanted to pursue it because it was getting in the way. There was things that were happening in life, and they were repeating patterns, and they just wanted an answer. And I think that now we have words for things that, as I was growing up, we did not have words for any of these things, or we called it something else. But I know that there's so many people that are exploring this now, and it's sort of opening the eyes of folks that it's not the stereotypically autistic kid, usually a boy, but not always, but often a boy on TV in something that is an actor that is, the we don't actually know, I think, if they're intellectually challenged, but they're trapped inside their body and they're acting out and all those kinds of things. So I've got a good question for you. Do you think that there are more autistic people now? So there's like these schools of thought about like this causes autism or that causes autism. Do you think that there are actually more people now that are, do you think we're just have better at diagnosing and finding it earlier?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The answer, in my opinion, is: are there more stars in the universe now, or do we have better telescopes?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
If you look through, there's a really great book by a gentleman named Steve Silberman. He did pass away, called Neurotribes, and it is very deep, and it goes through the full history of autism. Right, the history where before it had a name, as well as like what Leo Connors and Hans Asperger's, what their work is, even what you described, right? That stereotypical version of a boy, more likely a white boy, that was based on the specific sets, a dozen or less, of their patients, effectively.
Okay.
Right? That is where that came from, right?
Yeah.
So there's been advances not just in psychology, but also from neuroscience. And here's an example that I like to use and help people understand the evolution of psychology, even the DSM. I believe it was the DSM-1 when that still was diagnosing hysteria in women.
Yes.
That was retired. That is not a diagnosis anymore.
Correct. Yes.
I believe it was 1978 when homosexuality stopped being a disorder in the DSM.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
It was in the 2010s that being trans stopped being a disorder in the DSM. Right? And it moved to the informed consent model.
Yeah.
So there are evolutions, right? And as I said, the autism spectrum disorder evolution of collapsing things was also an evolution. But this is progress that we're making, and that ties directly to your question. Is it just that something is happening, or do we understand things better? And it really is, we understand things better.
That's what I think. I think we have names for things now that we had no words for. It was just like, that kid is different, so they got pushed to the side, or maybe there were some kind kids that would play with them. But I remember so many kids that I'm going to self-diagnose and say they were on the spectrum at some point, somewhere, somehow, or they had ADHD, or they had other situations going on, and they were just shunned and pushed aside, unless you had a mother like mine that said, don't let that kid sit alone. And then you were the one that went over to kind of draw them into things. So yeah, I think we are far better at naming things than we ever were before.
Yeah, and even that concept of naming things, right? Our brains have a hard time with things that are abstract, right? The brains are a prediction engine. So the more you understand, when you give voice to something, right? This is also from like a personal perspective. When you can give voice to something, including your feelings, why do we teach kids to name their feelings? Because once you name it, it loses its mysticism, its random power. We can't explain it, right? Like all of that stuff goes away when you can name it. Now, at least we can name something, but we've also associated stigmas and all of these different concepts with it. And now we have to dismantle what those are when it comes to those names.
Yeah. Did you have, when you were let's go back to when you were growing up. Did you have any of the emotional stuff go on that comes with why am I this way, not that way? If you see, a mainstream of more kids, I don't know. Did you have things come up for you when you were younger, or was it more that you got into adulthood, figured this out, and then it was like, oh, that's what's been going on?
Yeah. So remember that this has to be lifelong in order to get diagnosed.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's a criterion, right? So when they go through your social history, it can't just suddenly emerge as a new. If it emerged as a new thing and like right, that's more temporal. There's probably other explanations for what's happening. It could be
Okay.
stress. It could be lots of other things that are occurring in life.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, these are things that exist throughout your lifetime. Part of that social history process that you're going to work through with the diagnostician will uncover those things and the significance of what they mean in context before a diagnosis happens.
Mm-hmm. When you were and you still are, but as a leader in an organization, how did it impact you there? Did you find that you were able to read cues or things like that? How did it impact you leading other people or
Yeah,
being part of a leadership team?
it's a really really good question, right? And a lot of the work that I'm doing now and what I have on the autisticleader.ai, where I articulate some of this, right? The big difference, and again, I'm going to speak in this context specifically to me. There's absolutely lots of other autistics that are similar, that have similar patterns, but it does not apply to everyone. And I'll also point out there's lots of other types of neurodivergences, and neurodivergence doesn't require to have a specific label or a specific diagnosis, right? There's the broader socio-political movement of that as well. So I mention all of that to make sure that what I'm about to say relates to me specifically and how it manifests for me. Right?
Okay.
So the biggest thing for me is two things. I have something that's not individually diagnosed, but it's a concept that's common and it exists with a lot of autistics, is alexithymia. Alexithymia is when you are not able to identify your emotions in real time.
Okay.
And this has to do a little with, it's a combination of the entire nervous system, neurological processing, and cognitive and thinking profile. So it's a combination of all of those things together, right? So it's a sensory and cognitive component. The reason I mention it is when we think about leadership, emotional intelligence. That's the first
Right.
thing, right?
Right.
And what do we talk about in emotional intelligence? One of the components of emotional intelligence is being self-aware of your own emotions
Yeah.
and being aware of others' emotions.
Yes.
So, with being autistic and more specifically having a high version of alexithymia, this is not that I don't have the ability to understand my emotions. It's that it's not going to happen in real time, instantaneously, the way it might happen for most people, right? If you're feeling sad, you probably know pretty quickly that you're feeling sad, right? I don't. If, and for example, this is going to show a little bit, and it may sound silly to some people, but I'm going to be vulnerable about it. I use an emotion wheel still.
Okay.
I look at an emotion wheel, physically pull it up on my phone or my tablet, and I go map through what might be happening.
Okay.
That's me using my prefrontal cortex to rationalize my emotion.
Okay.
It takes time. It doesn't mean that I can't do it. It's just not instantaneous. And there's neuroscience behind this, right? There's fast circuitry, basal ganglia circuitry versus prefrontal cortex. We're all familiar with our amygdala versus the prefrontal cortex, right? So those amygdala activations, right, where your prefrontal cortex then kicks in and you have some version that recognizes that amygdala activation in a different way as well, that takes me active rational thought to figure out.
Okay.
I can, but same, right? Similarly, now the other aspect of emotional intelligence is understanding that in other people, right? So there's this common theory when it comes to autism, and there's lots of nuances behind how people talk about this today, and advancements are happening. But it's theory of mind. Theory of mind is understanding that other people have different thoughts, emotions, etc. Damian Milton introduced this concept of double empathy. double empathy, right, is saying it's not that, hey, just the autistic person lacks theory of mind, like this is part of the evolution, that they just don't understand, your emotions.
Mhm.
Both people don't understand emotions per se of each other. And more importantly, right, if we step outside the autistic lens for a second, this applies to any difference, right?
Yeah.
The idea of being able to predict someone's emotional landscape, Brené Brown talks about this.
Yeah.
This is pervasive in her work,
Yeah.
right? She ends her book, Atlas of the Heart, where she defines different emotions and how people use emotions wrong. She says the one thing that she's figured out during her research is you can't predict other people's emotions. This is
Yeah.
Brené Brown,
Yeah.
right? So
Yep.
we have built this concept of emotional intelligence based on identifying other people's emotions without actually asking them and not believing them when they tell you, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
go back to your question about what it means for me as a leader and how it shows up.
Yeah.
It's constantly, unfortunately, combating this version of emotional intelligence. And so the distinction that I make is emotional intuition versus emotional intelligence. Emotional intuition can't scale. Emotional intuition is what we've labeled emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
But what we're really saying is you are like me. Your lived experience might be similar to mine. Your cognitive profile might be similar to mine. The way you grew up, lots of things. And the more dimensions of similarity, the easier it is for me to determine what your landscape is because it's similar to my landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're in a global world. We're in the most rapidly changing world that we've ever faced.
Yes.
That doesn't apply anymore,
Right.
right? So part of what I've been really trying to help people understand when we think about the convergence of the neurodiversity paradigm, what
Hmm.
McKinsey, the World Economic Forum calls the brain economy, right? Which is
Hmm.
especially in the age of AI,
Yes.
brain health plus brain skills.
Yep.
We have to unlearn some of these things that we've learned if we're going to actually
Yeah.
bring the power of the human mind out,
Yeah.
especially today in the age of AI. And that to me is the biggest leadership shift that every organization is going to have to grapple with.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just in a conversation yesterday about AI, and the AI expert I had on with me talked about how, and I've heard this before, AI is just accelerating, it's blowing everything up. So if it was this before and AI comes in, it's like bigger and broader and massive. So the human element is more important now than it ever was before, but people are seeing it, like the fear is that that will go away and the machines will take over, and you know and
Yep.
we'll be back in the Terminator. So if people have seen that movie. So by the way, I want to welcome people who are watching us. LinkedIn tends to be where we have most of our audience, but also maybe on YouTube or Instagram, to put questions in the box. They should show up for us here in our background on StreamYard, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that people have in the moment as best we can. And if not, if it needs research, I'm sure we'll do that and then put it back in when the recording goes up instantly. Okay, so you sent me this amazing, handout that has so much information in it that I said, boy, you have a book there. And one of the things I really enjoyed reading about was these common things that we say in leadership and that we use in, I've seen it used against people in performance management. I've seen it used to promote, to deny promotion, all the things like read the room and you don't have leadership presence and all those things. But a lot of times there are no words that we're able to describe what that is for those of us that are like, I don't know what that means. So why would so talk a little bit about what leaders need to know leading a workforce that has all these different lived experiences, all sorts of neurodiverse situate, things within them. What about this let's start with read the room. Talk to me about how that impacts you and what advice you'd have for leaders.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? So this is where I like to make sure that we understand we're not saying that these are not important leadership skills. They absolutely are.
Yes.
What we're saying is that we've oversimplified across cognitive profiles and lived experience, right?
Yes.
How you can actually do these in a way that's universal, right? So when we think about reading the room, what you're often saying is when you walk in and there's some sort of shift that you feel, stop saying X, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool, right? And we measure leaders by can they contextualize quickly and
Yeah.
adjust the message because a leader's job is to influence,
Yeah.
right? So if we break that down, is that a valid leadership skill? The way I just articulated it sounds absolutely everything that everyone's heard. But there's a couple of fallacies in there. Now, if we break it down into what's valid and what should stay, and what may have, a fallacy we didn't realize, do we need to influence people as leaders? 100%, right? Do we need to contextualize and understand perspectives so that we can adjust how we influence? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Does that mean your communication may need to adjust? Absolutely. Now, we take all of those three elements and we bake them into in the moment, right? Or you're failed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the impact of in the moment impacts are also valid. It doesn't mean that, but the difference is as you scale globally, as you scale across differences,
Yeah.
you can't account for every moment and every impact in advance. So
Right.
what you need, and again, I'll go back to Brené Brown, vulnerable leadership.
Yeah.
Can you as a leader admit, hey, I didn't fully recognize that this is how this landed with you, right? So I want to validate that, right? And then a unique phenomenon happens even when leaders do that piece. Then you start having this bias of volume, right? Oh, well, the volume of how often someone felt this,
Mm-hmm.
right? But we don't think about the context of why that might be different. Have you ever heard of Barry Oshry?
Mm-hmm.
So
I've
Barry Oshry is one of my
yeah.
favorite systems thinkers.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to read you an excerpt directly from Barry Oshry that explains this exact concept, right? So I'm going to pull this up for a second. Hopefully you can, all right, right there. Our efforts to understand and intervene in organizational events have a persistent bias to interpret phenomena from a personal framework. In other words, situations are to be understood in terms of the needs, motivations, temperaments, personal styles, values, and developmental stages of one or more of the individuals involved. And if the diagnostic lens, this is the leadership lens, is personal, then it follows that the interventions will also be personal. What you mentioned, fix, fire, demote, replace, or suggest coaching or therapy for one or more of the parties. Barry Oshry says, I suggest an often overlooked lens that provides a deeper understanding of those phenomena and a range of more effective leadership strategies. This is a person in context lens in which phenomena are understood as the interactions of individuals and groups with the systemic context in which they and others exist. When we fail to recognize context, events are misunderstood and energy is misplaced. A missing leadership competency is seeing, understanding, and mastering the systemic context in which we and others exist.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I'm referring to when I say reading the room by itself is not sufficient. Executive presence by itself is not sufficient. Not only are we talking about individual moments, fast, like neuroscience related actual routing, we're also using an extremely personal lens all the time. And it's not always personal, right? It's not always who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah.
It's the system that produces that output for those contexts to even exist. And if your brain can only think about it as right and wrong and can't apply the context, you're always going to see right and wrong.
Yeah. And I would say like this is the norm and this is not. So that you have to kind of fit the box.
Right.
I love that you brought up Oshry because my background is in organizational development and leadership, and boy, do we study his work, and
Yeah.
boy, was it cool. I want to acknowledge Wayne Anderson's comment. Oh, there it is. I'll tell you, Nixie is amazing in the background there. Thank you. I love Laurie's point of view that the human element is more important now than it ever was before. AI didn't do anything new, but it's been a huge scale factor, and just as importantly, an accelerator. It compresses the time frame for a lot of key things. And we all have seen that in compressed time, often humanity gets lost without an intentional approach to bring it and preserve it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I love what Wayne said at the end, specifically about without the intentional approach to bring it and preserve it. Because again, on my website, autisticleader.ai, one of the frameworks that I've published is the AI cognitive strategy matrix.
Okay.
And the three categories that I talk about are preserve, enhance, and offload. And often the big conversation that's occurring today is that because leaders have thought about technology as an automation initiative, AI is viewed as automation, and that automation has created an accidental fallacy. People either offload or don't offload. So it's either I'm going to go to AI means AI does everything, or I got to own everything.
Yeah.
And that's an artificial binary, right? So what I talk about in my matrix is understanding when should you preserve your judgment. These are the scenarios where you can still use AI, but AI acts as a mirror for you to rationalize how your judgment, what are the potential impacts, allowing it to challenge your judgment, but still owning the judgment outright by yourself 100%.
Yes.
Then you have the leverage component when you're enhancing. And when you're enhancing, AI is helping you extend your thought, right? If you are doing a problem analysis, what are the root causes? This is where you are going to come up with some ideas, and then you're going to allow it, but it's not doing it on its own.
Right.
You have to guide how to extend that analysis. And then there's the real offloading, the automation, right? The formatting of a PowerPoint deck. You don't need to sit anymore and do the formatting and how do I take it and how do I visualize it. A really, really solid first, second, third cut can come from AI before you just formalize it yourself.
Yeah.
Right. As a small example.
I struggle with that because that's part of my get it in my head and form it up and spit it back out. There are things I love my AI for, and there's times when I'm like, I know I could do that, but I don't know if I should do that.
Right.
For me and the way I take in the information.
Absolutely.
So
right.
Yeah.
And that's part about organizations, right? So whether you have actively looked at it or not, people are using AI. Yeah. Including offline on their personal devices to help them with their work.
Yes.
Okay? So we have to, as organizational leaders, start recognizing this reality, right? Again, we want to do things like protecting our data, protecting, but just like about protecting your data, are you protecting judgment? Do you understand where judgment is being overridden by AI versus where AI is being the enhancement or the automation that it should be? And if you can't actually train your right, this is training your organization to not just think, it is to be aware of how you think. This is where metacognition is no longer a nice to have. It is leadership. And leadership is not just having your own metacognition, it's making sure your organization has metacognition skills.
Yes, yes. And by the way, I want to go back for a second. When you were talking about, we talked about reading the room and leadership presence. One of the things that I'd like to kick to the curb is the term common sense, because I totally believe, and I've heard people say like, well, anybody with half a brain can figure that out. I'm like, they can't though. They didn't have your upbringing with your parents and your siblings, and then that school you went to, and maybe you went to church and this other thing, all that comes together into what I might think is common sense. You might have a totally different opinion on. So whenever I hear leaders use certain terms, I'm like, stop. Let's discuss how that, your lived experience is different than somebody else's, your education. It's a unique mix. So I just think that we need to honor that.
100%, right? I love that you use the example of common sense, because ultimately, what is common sense? It's my prediction engine matches your prediction engine.
Right.
We predict the outcome the same way because our variables of how we've developed that outcome map are the same.
Yes,
That's all common sense is.
exactly. Thank you. Someone agrees with me. But a lot of times I get the when I say like let's kick that terminology to the curb, and here's why. So now I'm going to be also I think I may have published something at one point that said executive presence was bullshit. I'm not sure. This is my thing, so I can swear if I want to. And I do think it is a lot of times because it has evolved into this, the way you look, the way you talk, what education you have, what your background is. It's very narrow. And I just think as human beings, we are such each a unique blend of all the things that have happened to us and around us and things we've actively participated in and passively participated in.
Yeah, yeah.
So
No,
let's, yeah,
I agree with you. I think executive presence is absolutely BS. BS
yeah.
stands for belief system in how we're using it, right? Executive presence is nothing more than your belief system in how someone should look so that they can influence you. You're
Yeah.
willing to allow them to influence you because they fit the narrative of who you would allow to influence you. So the question I ask people often is, when you think about executive presence, what is the first version? What does that look like in your head? Does it
Right.
look like me? Does it look like Lori? Do you picture someone in a wheelchair? Do you picture a nonverbal autistic that uses an augmentation to speak, a machine? If none of those are things that come up in your mind, that's how you know executive presence is BS. It's your belief system.
Yeah, nice. And Wayne says, and often common sense is based in common values as much as common approaches or experiences. Yes, yes, yes.
100%.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So one of the things you brought up before that I wanted to ask about was this quick thinking under pressure. Do you have a way of, you mentioned earlier, like your hand gestures are because you went to a lot of speaking classes and things like that. And I've realized the older I get, the more time I have to think about it. I realize where did I start doing this and what was natural when I was little. And I'm not sure I remember accurately anymore. But what about the, not just read the room, but figure it out really quickly? Is there a way that you manage that for yourself? And what kinds of like coping mechanisms, I guess I would say, have you learned over time that work for you?
Yeah. So I think there's two versions of what you're figuring out quickly. So we talked about the figuring out what people feel, including yourself. So that dimension. And then there's the what are the risks and what do I need to think about in terms of the risks right now? And so for me, I think again this also speaks to the same global scale and complexity issues. There was a time in the world, maybe just about 30 to 40 years ago, where you could make a decision pretty quickly in the moment because the risk was something you could map, and the more experience you had, the more evident the potential impacts of those risks were, because the playbook did not significantly evolve. Now, there was still significant evolution because obviously there was a lot of advancement in the world in the 1900s with the Industrial Revolution. Now, I saw this amazing, I think it was a documentary, the AI doc is where I saw this, if I'm not mistaken. They talk about how the Industrial Evolution improved knowledge work in a very specific way, and how AI is going to advance every field out there. Every intellectual field out there is about to advance exponentially. Sorry, not about to, is already and is going to continue to.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, if you're a board level or executive leader, you need to think about geopolitical risk. You need to think about technology, cybersecurity risks. You need to think about every possible operational risk. That could be supply chain, information supply chain, operational processes, externally, market-wise, internally within your company. You have financial risks. And the amount of these risks in each of these categories is now increasing, right? Anthropic releasing mythos to about 40 different entities out there.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity risk, I guarantee we're about to see some very different 10K disclosures in the next few quarters, because we are going to see versions of cybersecurity risk that we couldn't have even fathomed before.
Yeah.
This is going to happen across all industries.
Yes.
And so when we think about that quick thinking, you can't rely on my experience and my history allows me to make the right call in the moment anymore. You need to make a call in the moment. So the new leadership trait is, can you recognize quickly that you don't have enough information?
Yeah.
Stop and say, here's what I know. And just so you know, what I know is based on this historical pattern. Here's the other data that I don't have yet. I
Yeah.
need time to go off and get it. So I'm going to give you, here's what I know today, but I want to be clear that this is not sufficient to make the decision. This is what's needed. So if I do have to make a decision, this is the body of knowledge that I'm using to make the decision. I would recommend we don't rely on this until we come back to it.
That is good advice because things are moving so fast and stacking one on top of the other. And I don't know how we keep up. I was thinking about my cybersecurity friends. I spoke at this big RSA conference a few years back, right before COVID, and made a wide circle of cybersecurity folks now. And they have to be going crazy with AI because things just aren't. I mean, it's just moving at the speed of sound. So yeah,
Yeah.
here we are. I love your approach to that. And by the way, folks, if you see me like off to the side, my office assistant, Maximus the cat, has joined us, first under the desk and now beside me, and he's demanding attention. So if you see me offline here, that's what's going on. Okay. So talk to me about anything else that I think we've covered most of the questions that we wanted to get through, but what do you want folks to know that we haven't really covered at this point?
I would say the one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, right, is what I'm calling, what I'm reframing as the concept of cognitive architecture. Now, that's not my own terminology. It's existed before me.
Okay.
Cognitive architecture is the intersection of the human mind and computational science, computers, etc. So what I'm keep coming back to with all of these things, right, is I think there's a convergence. The neurodiversity paradigm and all of the work has helped people understand there are absolutely different ways that people think, people
Yes.
sense, right? Nervous system differences, sensory differences, communication differences, thinking differences. And those things are not deficits. They could actually add a lot of value. And today, that matters more than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Then at the same time, you also have things like the brain economy, right? And we understand the execution is no longer the differentiating factor, right? That's where AI is going to cannibalize execution. So the differentiating factor is brain health plus brain skills. So this is where things like, regardless of your cognitive profile, your cognitive load. I saw this amazing piece. It was posted by the American Psychological Association. And so the psychologist, she's talking about call center reps, right? And she's saying, imagine this, and this is what's happening. A call center rep before AI and before all the automation had 80% of their job being the most routine. Hey, I can't log into my account. Hey, can you just tell me the balance? Right? And 20% of their day was the really hard work, the difficult, the customer's angry. They are right, whatever is ailing them at the moment, and you're dealing with that.
Mm-hmm.
So your cognitive profile of your work was 20% stress, and you had recovery time in your call load.
Yeah.
In the world of AI, especially today, and this has already been happening, but AI even more so, there's a lot more of the routine stuff that's automated.
Right.
So that call center rep,
Yeah.
now 80 to 90% of their day is only the hard stuff, not 20%.
Right.
What does that do to someone's cognitive load?
I agree.
Right? Now take that same concept, and that's one job that we can all understand, and apply it to the range of the level of problems that organizational and senior leaders are solving. And the rapid change of people in their organization solving those problems, having to make decisions regarding them.
Yeah.
This is a burnout concept. And this is where understanding those convergences about neurodiversity, brain economy, and what AI means, and starting to think about your, what I call organizational architecture, thinking architecture, decision architecture, and communication architecture. Those are the elements you need to think about to redesign how does work happen in your organization? How do you define work? And how do you think about work?
Yes. I do think you have to get out of it and kind of in front of it. Oh, I don't know if you can get in front of it anymore because it's just moving so fast. But you got to get strategic about it and figure things out, like pull out of the day to day to do that.
Right.
And the other thing, and I just mentioned this in the last time I did a talk last week, I was talking about how our bodies were not built for this. Our bodies and minds were not built for this pace, this fast, this much change. And I felt like, well, I think we're already seeing it with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, where I think our bodies and minds are going to go into another evolutionary phase. And if you're into the woo-woo, there's 7 planets lining up right now. So there's that, like today.
Yeah.
So like tomorrow, everything will be different if
Interesting.
we believe that. I do believe in that stuff. So here we are, sitting on the edge of I don't know what. But yeah, I just think that we are in that really interesting time in history where it's like leave almost all that behind and move forward. And I
Yeah.
think that people being able to just kind of circle back to putting words to this stuff that's been happening to us forever, but we didn't know how to define it. We just thought either everybody or nobody was doing this. You either feel like everybody must think the way I do, or nobody thinks the way I do. I don't know
Right.
that there's anything on the middle there. I just think it's an interesting time.
Yeah. It definitely
And
is.
I see another comment by Wayne. Thank you, Wayne, for actively participating. I'm sure
Yeah.
there are other people out there watching this as we invite AI to do more of the communication generation and drafting in the modern enterprise. What approaches do you suggest to help train teams to tell AI to address accessibility, yes, needs, when it fundamentally was trained on mass market content predominantly generated by sources not consistent with that value? I
Yeah.
have thoughts, but Uday, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, so for one, I think that this is a great call out, right? And so this is a little bit of what the Palantir CEO Alex Karp was talking about when he said, and I'm not sure that I agree with him that like only neurodivergents are going to thrive, or like I'm not sure I agree with the framing, but
Yeah.
he was getting to a little bit of this. And what I would say is the way I think about it, and what I tell people is, if you want to ask AI first, sure.
Mhm.
But instead of thinking about it as the answer, think about it exactly as that. You're getting the dominant pattern out of the way fast. Now
Yes.
we've got the dominant pattern.
Right.
Now let's bring that diversity of thought around it, right? So where it might have taken time to get to what are the patterns, you're getting the pattern, which means you can extend your thinking even more if you do it consciously. So that's
Yeah.
layer one. And then from an accessibility perspective, this is where the more we help different types of people interact with AI, provide training, right? So this is a little bit of a nuance and architectural component, but LLMs are trained on the mass publicly available data.
Yep.
Within an organization, you can take an LLM, add your organizational data specifically, right? This is what Claude Enterprise is looking to do, and
Yep.
create a RAG, a retrieval augmented type generation that's trained on your specific data. So
Mhm.
this is where organizations have an opportunity. Don't
Yes.
treat that as just an IT exercise. Treat
Yeah.
that as a people exercise.
Thank
This is
you.
where you have certain organizations that have combined the CTO and the CHRO into one role, because that's how that comes to fruition. How do
Yeah.
you design the roles? How do the people interact? To right, let's use a very basic version of this. Google DeepMind just hired a philosopher.
Mhm.
Anthropic has had a philosopher that wrote a 300-page manifesto and fed it to Claude to determine Claude's ethical system.
Interesting.
That same concept should be occurring in every single organization, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't be one role.
Yeah.
It should be your organization, your people interacting with that RAG layer to not just say, here's my expense policy, here's my insider trading policy, whatever might apply to you.
Mhm.
Here's how we think about how our organizational culture works. Here's how we think about how our organizational processes work. Not changing the process, how we think about how they work and how they influence the organization.
Yes.
We can do that. We can develop roles, allow people to take the time out of their day, right? This is where that 3-day piece that Jamie Dimon is talking about, right? And Sam Altman's talking about. We're going to have a lot more time in our days. And the type of work that we do is going to focus more on thinking. Here's the type of thinking you can do deliberately and build it into a practice in your organization.
Yeah. Yeah. We use a suite called Sintra at Aligned at Work. And I have trained Penn, the copywriter. There's 12 little bots and they do different things, and Penn's the copywriter. And I have trained Penn extensively, and it's ongoing, to think like me, write like me, spit it out. We now have a process where it's like, I just brain dump, Penn organizes it. I use he, him pronouns for him. And he organizes it, and then he spits it back. And then I'm like, this sound, and I'll say, take out the, it's not this, it's this. And he'll do that in one sentence and then go right back to it. So haven't mastered that one yet, but I will say, no. And I now take it off and do my own thing. Like I was in the very beginning. Sometimes I give it back, sometimes I don't. But that process is ongoing with the training. And what I like about AI is I don't have to worry about offending anybody. If I want to go back 5 times, 10 times, I usually stop at about 5. But if I were to go back 20 times on something, there's no emotional reaction of AI to, well, then why don't you just do it? Which I've encountered in the workplace when you're like, yeah, not quite. No, I'll know it when I see it. Try this. I don't like those colors, that font, those kinds of things. There's no emotion attached to that. But that's the very simplistic way. But I think that so many people will give some kind of AI a try and then say it didn't do what I wanted it to do. Like, you got to work with it. And my eyes were opened by a field service leader named John Takata that said to me last year, in the summertime, even individual contributors will need leadership skills because they will be working with teams. They will be leading teams of AI. And it was, sometimes you hear that one thing and it goes, wait, everything's different now. And that was the moment for me where I went, whoa, wait, I gotta take that in. And I've used that ever since that conversation. It's like, okay, gotta train them. Yeah.
That's what you just said is really, really important. And what that gentleman said, let me take it one step further.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just even the leadership skills. If you think about it, when you create an agent, what you just described, you're creating job descriptions.
Yes.
Which means you need to be very, very clear on the boundaries of job descriptions with those agents. You're also creating process, and how good your job description is and how good your process is how good your agents are going to interact.
Yep.
Now, in order to layer that, obviously the technology component is obvious. Now, it's not just the agents doing the work. Now you have humans, which means all the things that we're willing to, going back to Oshri, I'm just going to blame the human. If you have the human and the agent, you can't just blame the human, because if your boundary for the agent was clear, but the boundary for the human wasn't, guess what you're going to have? It's going to manifest as a process risk. It's going to manifest as an operational failure, right? And those are the friction points that we have gotten used to calling people problems, because there's just people on both sides. So as a leader, that job was easier. I'm just going to replace the people.
Yeah.
But you can absolutely replace the agent too. Sure. Yeah. But guess what? The agent's going to make it obvious that you're the problem because you're going to replicate the problem.
Well, that's like when people jump from one AI to the other. I didn't like it. Did you work with it? Did you do all you could do to get it where you wanted it or not? So I'm watching, we're coming up to the top of the hour and we want to put up some contact information. Let's put up Uday's site again, and the QR code so people can snap that or use that to, there we go. So you have the autisticleader.ai as your website. Yep. And I know you're working on building that out over time. Yes?
Yeah. The core concepts that we talked about and the frameworks are there now. right? I've started to publish some writing. So weekly, I publish some essays, and then I also narrate them. So they're available on podcasts across YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, right?
Love it.
And
Yeah.
so my goal is to continue on this, these pillars of convergence that I'm talking about, right? Not just neurodiversity, not just brain health, not just AI, but the convergence of all three in what in my mind is cognitive architecture work that we haven't started to do yet.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we have your LinkedIn profile probably in one of the banners. So we'll put your LinkedIn profile up so people can find you on LinkedIn. And how do you want them to get a hold of you?
I have contact information on my LinkedIn, and there's also pages directly on my website as well to contact me. There's also a subscription to my Beehive newsletter and the podcast as well. So lots of ways to contact me. Feel free to reach out. Would love to chat.
Very good. And maybe you want him to speak to your team. So because I think you're available to do that somehow. Yes.
Yep.
I've seen you on stage.
I definitely have some limited capacity for engagements, but I am more than happy to do that and work that out.
Very good. Okay, well, I want to thank you for being here today. This has been a fabulous conversation. I knew I would learn a lot, and I look forward to having an ongoing relationship with you as we have since 2018. And again, thank you so much for being here, Uday. And folks, go out and lead well, and as they say, live long and prosper. I think I have to do that. And,
Love it.
Okay,
thanks Lori. Take care.
Thank you. You too.